Jetpack. So in today's video, we're going to learn how to create an application using Jetpack Compose Clean architecture. So we're going to build a jet weather application that fetches data to an online API. So without any further ado, let's see what we're going to build. So this is the final state of our application. So we're going to build this beautiful looking application using Jetpack Compose. So here we get the current data, and this one is going to display today's data. And here we have the hourly data, which we can easily see. So, and this is just a scrollable and get our 24 hours forecast, and we can look at our weather. The next case here is whenever we want to check for 7 days forecast. So here we have 7 days, and actually we can scroll here and see, for example, here the next Monday, and the next Monday we can see our wind is 19.2 kilometer and it is heading southeast. And also we can check here sunrise, sunset, and UV index and other information. So without any further ado, let's see how we are going to build this. Any type of code, you can get the initial project from my GitHub repository. The link is provided in the description box below. So you can directly go to my GitHub repository and go to Jet Weather repo. And here basically you're going to get the initial project, and I'm going to iterate and add other branches, which you're going to see all the code here. So if you want to get started, you can easily just copy this and select this and directly go to Android Studio and start a project from Git repository. So when you successfully clone the project, you're going to get a folder structure like this one. So I have not changed much. So inside here, you can see we have a utils package, and inside this utils package, I have added two things. So the first case here is the tabs. So this one is going to help us in bottom navigation, and we're going to see how we are going to use it. And the next case here is the utils. Inside here, the utils package, I have added several things which are going to help us in formatting our data. So for example, to format our wind directions, so I have made this a list. And also we can format our data since we're going to receive data in Unix timestamps. So we're going to format the data. And also here you can use to format a normal date and also get the wind direction. So we are going to perform here simple calculations in order to get the wind directions. And also here is a when statement to get weather information from our code. And this basically gives us, for example, using this weather information. So whenever we get a code that is going to match this, then we are going to return here a clear sky and this drawable here. And mentioning here the drawables, I have added these drawables inside here. You can see we have all the drawables which are necessary to display our data. So the next important thing which I have changed here is our build.gradle. So I have added several dependencies which are really crucial for making our application. So we have added Hilt. Also we have added here the Hilt compiler. We have the navigation and also Kotlin serialization, Retrofit, and OK HTTP. And when you go inside here, you can see I have changed, for example, using this Google Hilt plugin and also Kotlin serialization library for serializing our data. Okay, so this is the API which we're going to fetch our data. So you can easily just go to this openmateo.com, and basically you are going to be directed to this API, and you can find the link in the description box below. And basically here you have to select different things. So for example, here you can select latitude, longitude, and also you can select the time zone, or you can leave it to default in order to set it. And after that, then you can easily select your variables which you want to get. So for example, here we want to get hourly weather variables, so we can get temperature, weather code. For our case, just let's select these two to keep everything minimum and simple. Another case here is the daily weather variables, which is going to give us, so it's going to give us a 7-day weather forecast. And for this case, we have selected here weather code, maximum temperature, minimum temperature, sunrise, sunset, UV index, and also the speed and also the wind direction in order to get this information. Another case is the current weather, and basically here we have the temperature, weather code, wind speed and direction, and also we can check if it's day or night. And here basically you can set the settings, what the temperature units you want to receive. We can select here Celsius, wind speed, we can use kilometer per hour and other things. So for example, here the time format, we're going to select Unix timestamp. And here basically you can just go down below here, and you can see we have here an API that is already written for us, so we can easily just test it. So for example, let's click here, open in new tab. Here is the information which you're going to get, and you can use a web browser formatter in order to keep your JSON neat. So for this case here, we get our data. For example, we get the current units, and here we get the current weather data. So you can see we get time and other variables here. We have our hourly data, and also we have our daily data. So basically we're going to copy this and directly go to Android Studio in order to use this JSON and create our application. Okay, so inside here, Android Studio, inside our Jet Weather app, we want to create a new package. So we can select here new and select package. And we want to create a data package. And let's create a remote package also. And here, let's create our models. Okay, so inside here, our models, we want to use this Kotlin data class file from JSON. So this is just an extension inside Android Studio. So you can just go to Extension Marketplace if you don't have this one and install it, because it's going to help you a lot. So for this case, let's click this. And here basically we can just easily paste our JSON data, and we can click here format in order to format it. You can see here we have all of our data. And another case, if this is just a new one, you can just click this advanced here in order to set it up. So for a case, we are going to select this val, and also we want to select the type, auto determine if it's nullable or not from JSON value. And another case is inside here annotation, and I'm going to directly select Kotlin serialization for a case. So if you want other serialization, you can easily use, but for a case, let's use Kotlin serialization. Now, in order to generate here, we can create our API. So let's plus here a class name, API weather, and click generate here. So here we're going to generate this data here. As you can see, we have our API weather, and everything here is actually provided. So you can see we have it's providing us with this serialization. So this plugin is actually great. Okay, so I'm going just to rename here and keep everything neatly and organized. So here we have our API current weather, we have our API daily weather, and also we have our hourly weather, and also the API weather, which is going to combine everything. So the next case here, I want to create a list of constants. So basically here we can create a new Kotlin class, and let's just call this K here. Okay, so this is just our object that we are going to use here to keep our constants. So for example, we have the base URL. So our base URL is this API here. Okay, the next case here is to defining the endpoint, and our endpoint is just going to be forecast in order to get the forecast data from this API. So another case here, I want to create a list of API parameters which we're going to have. So for example, these are the names of the parameters. For example, we're going to get here latitude, longitude, daily, current weather, hourly, time format, and time zone. So we want to avoid having typos. So everything here is going to be included. So we have the necessary information to communicate to our API. So the next case here, we can create now a weather API, because we are using Retrofit here. So in order to communicate to the API, we can create an interface that is going to help us to orchestrate this communication to the API. So for this case, inside here, let's create a new Kotlin class or file. And here we want to create an interface. And this we can just call here weather API. Okay, so inside here, weather API, we can create our function that is going to help us to fetch the data. So I want to disable this. Just disable AI completion. Okay, so let's create here a function in order to communicate to the API. So we can create a suspend function and call this get weather data. Okay, so in order to make this a network request, we have to tell Retrofit, hey, this function is going to be a request. So for this case, we have to specify at get function. And here basically we can use our constant variable which we have created, and we have to specify the endpoint. Hey, we want to go to this particular endpoint, and Retrofit is going to make up the rest. Okay, so inside here we can create the queries which we want to get the data. So for our case here, we want to pass in several parameters. So let's specify at query. And here basically we can specify a parameter name. So for example, this is just going to be the latitude. And for our case, we are just going to hard code this variable. So you can just get your own latitude, or you can create a separate function that is going to get you a latitude. So for our case, we're just hard coding this. So this one is going to be 6.8. Okay, so here we can use our API parameters. Another case is we want to create a longitude, so we can just press Ctrl D here and duplicate this. So this one is just going to be longitude. Okay, so another parameter, as when you inspect our URL, we have an array of strings that is supposed to be sent. So for example, this one is just going to be a daily. So when we query for daily data, we are getting more than one parameters. So for this case, we have to specify. So for a case, we can just call here our API parameters, daily. And we can just call this parameter daily. Now, in order to make this, we have to use an array string. So here we can call array of and specify the parameters which we want. So here you can see we want to get the weather code. So you have to type these parameters as how they appear here, otherwise the API is going to throw an error. So for this case, we have this weather code here, and we want to pass in here temperature and also wind direction, sunrise and sunset, and also UV index. So this one is going to return us with the parameters. Okay, so we have our daily here. Now the next case, I want to create the query parameter for current weather. This one, which is just going to be also an array string, and basically we want to get these parameters. So we want to get the temperature, is day, weather code, wind speed, and wind direction also. And lastly, we want to get the hourly. Okay, so for our hourly, we want to get only two parameters here. We want to get the weather and also the temperature, which is just 2m. So these are the data which we are going to require, but the next two important parameters which we have to specify here is the Unix timestamp and also the time zone which we are going to set. So for a case, we are just going to set this. So we want to set the time format, and this time format is going to be a Unix timestamp, and by default we are going to set it to this one, and also the time zone. So you can select any type of time zone. So for my case, I've gone with this one here. Okay, so our function is complete here. We have our get weather data. So we have to specify the return type. And because this is just a suspend function, then we can easily just return here the object as whole, because it's going to suspend the operation whenever we make a network call. So for case, we want to return an API weather, which is going to be returned by the API. Okay, so our API is actually complete here. So the next case, I want to create the modules for our domain. As you can see inside here, the remote modules, we are just getting a lot of data, which is not formatted and how we require it inside to display our data inside our UI. So for this case, we can create the modules that are coming from the domain, and these one are going to be formatted in how we want the data to be displayed inside our UI. So for this case, let's just directly go inside here and create a new package. So let's create here a new package. And we can call this domain. And inside here, we're just going to create our modules. Okay, so inside here, let's create a new coding class of file. And inside here, we're going to create a current weather. So we can just call this current weather. So we want this to be a data class. Okay, so the first case here, we want to create a temperature. So for weather status here, we're going to return a weather information item, which is just of type string. Wind speed, which is just going to be of type double. And here we can check is day, which is just going to be a Boolean variable. Okay, so we can create here another class, and this class is going to be for daily. So let's just call this daily. Okay, so we are going to make these variables private. So here we're going to get the temperature, which is just a list of double. And here we want to create a temperature mean. And time is going to be a list of string. So inside here, we're going to get these parameters, all of them, and I have made them private so that we cannot use outside of this class here. So we're going to expose another variable that is called weather information, and this one is going to be a data class that we're going to create here that is going to compile everything inside a neatly formatted data. So for this case, we can just create a data class and call this weather information. And basically what we can do is create the variable. So we can just create all of these variables. So instead of a list, we can just keep this as the year. So basically what we can do is easily just copy this. Let's copy everything. Let's press Ctrl C and paste it here. Okay, what we can do, we can press Ctrl Shift and Alt and duplicate and create a new cursor. So for this case, we can easily, let's just click in every place where we want to make changes. Then we can just easily now go directly inside here and highlight this, press Ctrl X. And here we can just paste this. Let's go press home here, press Ctrl Shift and delete this one here. Let's align everything perfectly. Okay, so we have everything here neatly created. So for this case, in order to use this information here, we can easily just create another variable that is called weather information. So let's create here another variable. Let's call this weather info. And this one is just going to be a list of weather information of the data class which we have created here. So let's call this weather info. Okay, so inside here we can call a get function. So we can create a mutable list. So for example, let's create here a variable and call this daily weather info. Okay, so for this case here, we can create a for loop. So let's create here a for loop. And basically for I in, we can use any one of the variables we want to loop through everything and create this variable here. So for that case, we can use, for example, a temperature because everything is going to have similar length. So for this case, we can call indices. Okay, so inside here, we want to call this daily weather info. So you can use here a map in order to map this. So we're going to see in another place where we can do this. Basically, you can easily do this by calling here add. And basically what we want to add here is the weather info. So we can just call here weather information. And inside here now we are going to add, for example, the temperature max. And we can just call here the temperature max and iterate through it by using I. And do the same for other parameters here. So we have the temperature mean, the time, weather status, and other parameters which we're going to get here. Now for that case, we have to return here. So we can just call return and we want to return daily weather information. And basically everything is structured inside here. So we can easily access this weather information and get everything inside one data class. Okay, so next here, let's create another that is just for hourly. So let's create a new coding class of file. Okay, so similarly here, we're going to create a variable that is just called the temperature. And this one is going to be a list of double. And also here, we're going to receive time, which is just going to be a list of a string. And here we have weather status. It's just going to be a list of weather information. Let's call this weather info item. So similarly here, we can do as how we did to our daily. So we can create a variable that we can access. So we can just call this weather info. And this is just a list. Let's create here a data class. Let's call this hourly info item. Okay, so this list here is going to be hourly info item. Let's specify a get function. And here basically we can easily just return. Now we can just call, for example, time, and we want to call map indexed. So here we're going to receive an index and also time. Okay, so let's create here hourly info item, what we want to map to. So for our case, we can just call here temperature. So we can just call here our temperature, and we want to pass in here the index. Similarly, we can pass in here the time. And here basically we have our item time, so we don't have to loop around through it. And we can pass in here weather status. And we can pass in here the index directly. Now the last class which we want to create inside here our domain is weather. That is going to combine everything. Okay, so this is just a data class. And here we're going to have the current weather, the daily, and also the hourly. Okay, so now we have all of our data. The next case here is we want to create mappers to map between the remote models to our domain models. So we can easily do this by creating mappers. So let's go inside here our data and create another package. So for this case, we're going to create here mappers. And for a case, let's create a new Kotlin class of file, and we can create an interface. So we can call this API mapper. Okay, so for this case, we want to make this generic. And here, basically, we're going to have a domain item and also the entity item. So we can just call this entity. And this one is going to have only one function that is going to be mapped to domain. And this one is going to be an API entity, and it's going to be of type entity. And what it's going to return is going to return a domain. Okay, so we have here our interface. Now we can create our implementation for these interfaces. So for this case, let's create a new package here and call this. Okay, so we want to create here a new mapper. So let's start with the daily mapper. So we can call this API daily mapper. Okay, so this one is going to inherit from the API mapper. And basically here we're going to pass in a daily. And that is going to be API daily weather. Now we can press Ctrl I and map the information here. Okay, so we have our function, and what we want to do is to return our daily. So here we can call return daily. Okay, so for example, here we can return our temperature max. And we can just call here our API entity and temperature max, because this is already in a double. And here we can pass the minimum temperature. Now we want to use the time, and you can see the time is going to be inside the timestamp. So we want to create a function that is going to help us to pass the time. So for this case, let's create here a private function. So the time is going to be in a list of long. This one is going to return us with the time as a list of strings. So what we can do here is call return. Let's call here our time.map. Okay, so we can use our utils package and call format Unix timestamp. So for our pattern, we want to get, for example, this is daily, so we want to get only the day. By passing here a pattern of E, is going to return a single day, and pass in it here as the data which is going to be formatted. So for this case here, we can just call pass time and call here our API entity dot time. Okay, the next class is weather status. And also here we want to create another function that is going to pass the weather status. Create here another private function. Okay, so our code is in terms of an integer, and we want to get back a list of strings. Sorry, a list of weather information. Okay, so here we can call our code, and we want to map, and we can use again our util and call get weather information and pass in it here. So you can press Ctrl B here, and it's going to take you to where we have specified this function. So you can see we have here weather codes, and basically we are returning weather information. So let's go back to our daily weather mapper. Okay, so our time here is actually returning int, and what we want to do is to change this back to long, and everything is working perfectly. Okay, so for our weather statuses here, we can just call pass weather statuses, and we want to pass in the API entity dot weather code. Okay, we can pass in here the wind direction, and also we can create another function that is going to pass the weather direction. Okay, so this one is going to return a list of strings. So we can call here return and call our wind directions dot map again. And now we can call our utils package and call get wind direction. And here basically we can pass in it in order to format the wind direction. So here we can call our API entity, and we can pass in here our API entity now. And for our sunset, we can call here our API entity, and we can map here directly, for example. And we can format our Unix timestamp. And for our time here, we want to get an hour, so we can get here HMM, so M, in order to get the Unix timestamp in terms of hours and minutes. So for this case, we can call it .long. Okay, let's just press Ctrl D here, and instead of sunset here, we can call sunrise. And here let's change to sunrise. And let's call here UV index, and we can call our API entity UV index. Okay, and then we have wind speed. So we can call here our API entity wind speed. Okay, also here we can change back to long. Inside our API daily. So let's go back. Okay, so this is supposed to be double, so let's make it double, no problem. Okay, so everything is working perfectly. Here we have mapped our API daily mapper. Okay, so the next case, let's create here another mapper. Okay, now let's create a mapper for hourly data. So let's call this API hourly. Okay, so similarly, this one is going to take from API mapper. And for our domain here, we're going to have our hourly. And here we have our API hourly. Okay, let's press Ctrl I. Our hourly data which we have. Okay, so for the case of temperature, we can just call here our API entity temperature. The next case, we can get our time. Now we can create another function to pass our time. So create here a private function. Here let's call pass time. And let's call our API entity. Now the next case is weather statuses. So similarly here, let's create another function. So we can just duplicate this. Okay, so we have to change this to long, which is just API daily. API hourly. Now everything is working perfectly. Now the next case, we can create the mapper for current data. Okay, now let's create here a new quoting class. Let's call this current weather mapper. Okay, so here we're going to get this from our API mapper. And here we want to get the current weather and the API current. Similarly, let's press Ctrl I and map this. Now we can return here. Let's create our current weather. We can pass in here the temperature. And we can call API entity temperature 2M. And time, similarly, we can create here a private function. Okay, so here we can return our util.format Unix timestamp. Okay, so now our pattern is going to be this one here. And here we can pass in our time. Okay, so I want to create another function again, so we cannot come back again here. So we can create here passing the weather statuses. So let's call this pass weather status. Okay, so here we can pass our time. Okay, so here the API is going to return is day in terms of number. So we are going to check if it's going to be equal to 1. Basically, this one is going to be a day. So here we can change. You can see we are getting this one is supposed to be an int, and it found a double. And here also it's required to be long, and it found an int. So we can just change this. Change this to long. And also here wind direction. Let's change back to double. And here everything is working perfectly. Okay, so lastly, let's create here now the API weather mapper that is going to map everything. Here we're going to get our weather, that is our domain entity, and for our API entity, that is API weather. Now let's press Ctrl I and map this. Okay, so we want to inject this constructor here because we're using here Dagger Hilt for injection. So let's import this, and we want it to handle our dependencies. Okay, so the first case, we want to get our API daily mapper. Okay, so instead of hard coding here the API daily mapper, so what we are going to do is to pass in the interface. So the interface is our API daily mapper. And for our daily, we are just going to pass in here daily and also the API daily weather. So this one is going to be our API daily, and then when we are injecting this, we're going to add annotations so that Dagger Hilt can know which dependencies it should provide for this particular dependency here. So we're going to see when we create our API mappers, our API mappers dependencies. Okay, so here we have our API daily mapper, our API current, and our API hourly. And all of these one are just interfaces. When we provide the dependencies, then we are going to provide annotation to this particular class to let Dagger Hilt understand, hey, when you provide this particular dependency, you have to provide this one. So we're going to see how we are going to do this. Okay, so for this case here, we can just call our return, and here we want to return our weather. Now let's call here our current weather, and we can just call here our API current weather mapper and call this map to domain. Let's pass in here our API entity, and we want to pass in current. This one is going to map for us. Another case is our daily, and let's call here our API daily mapper and call map to domain. And similarly here, we can just pass in here our daily data. The next case is to pass in for hourly. And now we have all of our mappers ready. Okay, now let's go directly inside here and create our dependency package. So for this case, let's insert here. Let's call this DI, and basically here we can pass our dependencies. So the first case, let's create an object, and this one is going to be our mappers module, so that we can provide the dependencies for our mappers. Okay, the first case, we have to tell Dagger Hilt, hey, this one is going to be a module, so it can generate the implementation for these particular dependencies. Another case is we have to say at install in and give it a particular scope of which it's going to be available, these dependencies. So we want this to have a singleton component. Okay, so here we have our module. Now we can start to provide our dependencies. But here we cannot just provide directly our dependencies because we have only one particular interface. So Dagger Hilt is going to get confused. So let me just show you an example. So whenever we want to provide here, we can just pass in here at provide and create a function. So for example, here we can call provide. And basically this one is going to return API daily mapper. So for this case, we have to pass in here daily. Okay, so for this case, we can just call here return. Okay, so for this case here, Dagger Hilt can understand, and whenever we get these particular dependencies, then it can just return this one. But we want to make it more clear to the plugin here to understand whenever it want to provide a particular dependencies, then we have to tell it, hey, this one is going to be a daily mapper. So for this case, we can create another annotations, our custom annotations to help Dagger Hilt for this case. So we can just go below here and create another functions, another annotations. So for this case, we can use @qualifier and add another @retention. Now we can provide here annotation retention .binary. Okay, so here we can create an annotation class. So this one is going to be API daily. And that's it. So the next case, we can just duplicate these. Okay, so here we can pass in API weather. Okay, so with this, we can tell Dagger Hilt, hey, this one is a particular dependencies, so you can inject this directly. So sometimes it can get confused and inject other things which is not supposed to. So for this case, you can just come back here and provide the annotation. So for a case, this one is just API daily mapper annotation. And here we can pass in API current weather annotation. And here it's going to return current weather. And here we're going to get API current weather instead of returning API daily. So here we can return current. And here let's pass in API hourly. Sorry. Let's just duplicate this. Okay, so here we are going to get our API hourly mapper. So what we can do, let's just go directly inside our mapper implementation, and we want to get all of these. So we can just copy, press Ctrl+C. Let's go back here and paste it. And here we can create a multiple cursors by pressing Ctrl+Shift+Alt. Let's go back home. And here we have every parameter which we want. And basically here now, what we want to return is our weather. And here we can return our API weather mapper. Okay, so basically here we are providing all these dependencies which we are going to require whenever we want to create this particular API weather. So we have our API daily, API current weather, and API hourly. So this one is going to help us to provide that. And one thing which we can do inside here is go to our API weather mapper. So for example, here we have created those annotations. So whenever we want to inject this particular class, so here we can pass in those qualifiers which we have passed. So for example, here we can call our API daily. And similarly here we can create, this one is current, so we can pass in here our API current. And we explicitly make the Dagger Hilt dependency understand that whenever we want to provide these dependencies, then you can choose this one and everything is going to be perfectly fine. We have here everything what we require for our dependencies to be injected. So the next case, I want to create a dependency for our API module. So for this case, let's create here another class. And basically you can select an object and let's call this API module. And similarly here, let's annotate this with @module. Okay, so we are going to use JSON to pass our data. So I want to also create our JSON converter that is going to help us in converting our data. So for this case, we can create here a private variable. Let's call this JSON. And this way here, we can use our JSON from our converter and we want to configure it with several things. So the first case is coercing the input values. So if the input values can be mismatching, so we want to coerce them so our application will not actually crash for this case. And if we don't have, for example, keys which we are not going to have inside our data classes, so it can ignore unknown keys whenever this particular class is going to throw out to us. Okay, so we want to provide here API. Now we have to get a builder that is just going to be a retrofit builder. And this one is going to return us with the API. Okay, so here we can just return. Let's call our builder. Okay, so here we can provide our API and directly just create here a builder, and we are using a retrofit builder. We are building and creating to our weather API, which we have already created. Now the next case, we want to provide the retrofits because this is just a third-party library, so we can just provide, and let's make this also singleton. So we can just call provide. Because you can see here, we're providing this as a dependency. So here we're going to create it. Now the first case, we want to get the content type. We have to tell our application, hey, we are expecting here a JSON. So we can just call this application /JSON and we want to convert this to media type. And we can provide now the base URL in which we want to fetch. And this one is inside our constants. So we can call here k.API base URL. And we have to add the converter factory so that it can understand, hey, I want to use this factory to convert this data from JSON to Kotlin. So for this case, we can just call here our JSON, which we have created, and pass it as converter factory. And here we have to pass in the content type. And everything is perfectly fine here now. Now here we can try to build our project in order to make the plugin here to generate the implementation for what we have written and see if we have any error and fix it before we continue. Everything is synced perfectly. Now we are perfect to continue. Okay, so the next case here, I want to create our repository. And for this case, we can just go inside here our domain. And let's create a new package and here we can call our repository. Okay, so I want here to create a response class that whenever we create our repository so that we can get that response class. And that response class is going to help us manage between different states. For example, if we are loading and getting a data or we have any errors, so we can easily manage this. Let's go inside here our utils package and I want to create a response class for this case. So we can just call this response. Okay, so this one is going to be a SLD class. So here we're going to have T and we have to create here a data that is of type T. And also we have the message that is going to be of type a string. And by default, this is going to be equal to null. And also this by default is nullable. Now let's create here a class, the first class that is going to be a loading state. And this one is going to be of type T and inherit is from our response class. Another class which is just of success. So here we can create our success. And for our success part here, we're going to receive data. And here we can pass in the data. Okay, the next case here is whenever we have error. So let's create an error class. And here we can pass in the message. Okay, so this one is going to be the state of our class. Now we can create our repository. So let's go inside here and create an interface, and let's call this weather. And here we can get our weather data, and this one is going to return us with the flow. Here we're not getting the dependency for coroutine. So for example, here we're just getting UTs concurrent and annotations. So what we want is to get for coroutines. So I don't know, we did not add this dependency. So for this case, we can just go here to a build.gradle file. So for this case, I can just add this dependency here for including coroutines. We want to change this to new library catalog. Let's call sync here to our repository. And now we have the coroutine flow and we can just easily import it. Okay, so everything here is perfectly. So we have here weather repository. Now we can create our weather repository implementation inside here our data. So for this case, let's create here a new package. Okay, so here we want to inject the constructor. And basically we want to pass in here the weather repository. So let's pass in the weather API. And here we can pass in API weather mapper. And this class is directly going to inherit from our weather repository. Now let's press Ctrl I. And implement this data here. And this one is going to directly turn us with the flow. So let's go with the flow. Okay, so here we can emit first that we are loading. So we can just call here a response. Now we can make an API call. So we can get here API weather and get weather data. Okay, so we have our API weather. Now we want to map everything. So we can create here our weather data. So let's call this weather. And we want to map to domain. And here we can call our API weather. And basically it's going to map it. And here we can emit success now. And if we have any error, we can try to catch it here. So let's call here catch. Can print the structures to see if we have any error. So let's rename this to E. And here we can emit our response error. And here we can emit our message. And if it's not, then we can just return empty. So here we have our repository. So I want to create a dependency module for this. So for this case, let's create a new coding class of file. And here basically we want to call this activity. Okay, so we want to scope this module to be specifically retained according to the activity. So whenever the activity is going to be closed, then and this module is going to be killed. So the dependencies, we cannot have duplicate of them. So for this case, we can create here at module. And basically here we can install this. So let's call it install in. Instead of a singleton component here, we can just call this activity retained component, and here we can make this to be class. Okay, so here we want to make this abstract because we are going to be binding data. We can just call at bind, and let's copy this to activity retained module. Now let's create an abstract function. Let's call this bind weather repository. Okay, so here we can provide the weather repository implementation, which is going to bind the type of class, which is just an interface which we have created. So whenever you want to provide dependencies for dependencies, interfaces, basically you can use at binds and provide here the repository implementation. For example, here the implementation class, and then here you can provide the particular repository which you have. So for this case, we can just use at binds, and basically everything is going to work perfectly. Okay, so now let's try to make our project and see if everything is working perfectly. Everything here is working perfectly, and our Gradle has built successfully. So I think we have made a bit of progress here, and everything inside our data and domain is complete. So the next case here is to deal with our UI part. Okay, so the remaining part here is our presentation, and we can do this next. Now we have to deal with the UI, and basically let's just go inside this package here. And basically here I want to create a new package. And for a home package here, I want to create a new coding class, and let's create a home view model. Okay, so this class here is going to inherit from the view model class. Okay, and let's annotate this with at hilt view model. And we can inject our constructor. Now we can pass in here the repository. So let's create here a private variable, and let's call this repository. And basically pass in here the weather repository directly. Okay, so the next case, we want to create a data class that is going to hold us a state. So let's create a data class. Let's call this home state. So the first case, we are going to get the weather. Okay, so this one is going to be nullable, and by default, this is going to be null. The next case, if we have any error, that's going to be of type string, and by default, this is null. And we can check here is loading. And this one is going to be a Boolean variable. And by default, this is going to be false. Okay, another case here, I want to get daily weather info, which is going to be arising from our daily weather information. And this one is nullable by default. Okay, now let's receive here our home state. And let's create a mutable state. So since we are using Jetpack Compose, we want to keep this immutable state of. And basically here, let's construct a new home state. And let's make this private set so that we cannot set outside of this class. So I want to create an init block, and whenever I initialize a view model, I want to fetch the data directly. So let's create here a view model scope. Okay, so here we can use our repository now. and we want to get the weather data. So let's call here get weather data. And basically we have a flow, so we can easily just collect here. And we are going to receive the response. Now we can use here when statement to iterate through those three state classes: loading, success, and error. So here we can pass in our response. Now let's check here if is loading. And actually, if this is loading, we can call here our home state, and we want to update our home state. Then we can change here is loading and change this back to true. Okay, let's duplicate this. And here we have success. And here we have error. Whenever we have success, we are not loading, so we can keep this back to false. And if previously we had an error, we can just pass it back to null. And the next case here, we can pass in the weather data. So let's pass in here the weather. So we can just call here response load data whenever we have a successfully data fetching. Okay, the next case is I want to get a particular date. So for this case, we can create here. Let's call this today daily weather information. So whenever we send a response, then basically we are getting a lot of data. So we can easily filter this. So we can just call here response.data. Let's get here our daily data and get our weather information, and we want to actually find. So we can use here a find because this is going to be a list. So here we can call our util, and we can check is today date. And basically if it is going to be a today date, so we can call here it.time. Now we can get a today daily info, and basically this is just going to be a single item because our response here can be, for example, 7 days. So you want actually to find the today's date. So we can use here our utils. So when you press Ctrl B, it's going to direct you here. So what we are doing is getting the date, and basically we are comparing the today's date and actually the day which is going to be fetched, which we passed here. And that is just the date which we passing here. So after we find that, we can easily change again our state. So let's just call here our home state, .copy. Okay, so we can change here our daily weather information and basically pass in the today daily weather info, and everything is looking perfectly. And whenever we have error here loading, we can just pass in to be false, and let's pass in here the error, and that is just the error message. So here we can just call our response.message, and everything is looking perfectly. So our view model is complete, and next we want to create our UI, and basically we want to create this particular home screen first. So for this case, let's just go directly here and create a new Kotlin class or file. Okay, now let's create a new composable, and basically we are going to call this home screen. Okay, so one parameter which I want to pass here is the home view model, and basically here we can easily use a Hilt view model to provide this directly through the composables because we're using Hilt here, and we can easily, let's just collapse this. Okay, now here we can just get our home state. So let's call here home state, and we can use our home view model. Home state. Okay, so I want to surround everything inside the box so that we can easily align them. So let's create here a box composable. Okay, so the first case we can just pass in here the modifier, and I want to fill the max size. And we can give it a padding of 16 dp. Now let's create here a when statement, and I want to check here if actually we are loading, so we can just call here our home state.isLoading. And if we are actually loading, I want to show a progress bar. So here we can check if this is true. Then basically here we can show a circular progress indicator. And if not, basically here we can use an else. And if we are not loading, basically now we are in a success state. So basically we can display here our data. And I want to use here our home state. So we can call here our home state. And we can check here our weather. And this weather can be nullable. So I want to use here a let scope function, basically to scope this. If it's not going to be nullable, then we can easily access. So for this case, I want now to create the first item here. As you can see, we have this weather status here. Now we can display the current weather status. So let's create here another composable. Okay, now let's create here another composable, and we can call this current weather. And actually here we want to receive our current weather. Okay, so you can see this is the item which we want to build. The first case here, we have an icon, then we have the text, and here we have other statuses. So for this case, I can create here an icon. So let's create here an icon. We can use a painter. Let's pass in here a painter resource. And we can just call here our current weather. And let's call here our weather status. And we want to pass in here the icon. And here basically we want just to pass null. Okay, the next case here, I want to give it a size. So let's use here modifier. Okay, so I want to surround everything inside the column. So I can press Ctrl X and copy at this. Let's create here a column. Okay, so here first I want to pass in here the modifier. And we can just give it the default modifier. Another case, we can pass in here the horizontal alignment. So let's call here alignment.center horizontally. And the vertical alignment also we can just arrangement here, sorry. Arrangement.center. Now let's pass in here our icon again. Okay, so let's pass a little bit of a spacer. And we can give it a height of 8 dp. Okay, so after we create this icon, I want to display this text here. And basically we have this degree. So I want first to create a variable, a constant variable. Let's just go above here. And basically we can use an escaping sequence for this. Okay, so we use here an escaping sequence with this 4 zeros. Then we are going to get a degree whenever we pass this inside a string. Now let's create here our text. So we can use here our current weather. And basically we want to display here the temperature. We can just call here our temperature. And we can convert this to string. Also we want to add that degree sign, so we can concatenate this with the degree. So let's pass this degree text here. Okay, the next case, I want to change the style. So we can pass in here the style. And we can use display media. Okay, let's copy this. Okay, so here instead of 80 dp, we can just give it 4 dp to differentiate this with other text. Okay, let's copy also this and paste it here. Okay, so here we can hard code this weather status. Okay, now we can use here our string template, and what we want to access here is the current weather. So let's call here our current weather. And here we can call weather info to get that weather info. So you can see here it's mainly clear. Okay, so here we can use body large instead of that display large. Then let's press Ctrl D again. Also we can just copy this and paste it here. Okay, so let's change this here. We can just call this wind speed. Okay, the next case here, I want also to display the wind direction. So let's create here our current weather. can call here wind speed, and actually this is kilometer per hour, so we can just call this kilometer per hour. And now everything is looking perfectly. And here we can just change this to body, medium, not small. Our current weather item now is complete. We can just go back directly here. Let's just call here our current weather item, the weather item. So let's pass in here our weather, it.current weather, and let's pass in here the modifier. And since we're using here a box, so everything is going to be aligned at the center. So I want to provide this self-alignment, so I can use here align modifier, and basically I can pass in here the alignment to top center. And this one is going to be aligned at the top. Okay, so the next case here, we want to create this card here, which is going to display hourly data and other information. So for this case, let's just go below. And we can create here a new composable. And here we can receive our hourly weather item. Okay, so the first case, I want to create a card to surround everything inside the card. So let's create here our card. Let's pass in here a modifier. And we want to fill the max width. Okay, so for our card here, I want to create these top items. So you can see we are aligning this inside the row. So we can easily create here a row and keep these two variables. So let's create here a row. Okay, so we can give this a modifier. In the first case, I want to fill the max width. Then we can give it a padding of 16 dp. Make everything aligned perfectly. Okay, the next case here, we can pass in the horizontal alignment, and we want to call arrangement.space between, so we can arrange everything at either parts. Okay, so for that case, the first item, I want to pass in here the text that is today. As you can see here, we have the text that is written today. So let's create here our text. So let's just call this today. The next case, we can change here the style. Let's use body medium here. Okay, another case is to create that text which is going to give us the date. So let's just, and for the part of text here, we can use our utils package in order to format our date. So we can call here format normal date, and we want to use this particular pattern here. And let's construct here a normal date. And actually this one is going to give us the today's date. Okay, so our first item here is complete, which we have these two text. Now we want to add also a horizontal divider here. So here I want to pass in the horizontal divider. It's telling me to add the import. So for this case, I think here, let's just go to our version catalog. And basically we have here the material 3. And I think one thing which we have to do here is to update. So we can easily just update this to a latest one. So we want to update the compose bomb version. So let's change this back to 2024/6. Because that is actually 2023. Let's sync here the project. Okay, so after we bump up our data, basically this one is going to be available, our horizontal divider. Okay, so for this case, we can just pass in here thickness, and I want to use 2 dp. And the next case here, we can change the color. So let's use here material theme .color scheme, and I want to use on surface variant. Okay, so after that, then we want to display this data here, and we can use here a lazy row for this case. So let's create here lazy row. Okay, so I want to give it a padding, so we can just give it padding of 16 dp. Okay, so here we can use items. Okay, so here we can display our weather information. And basically I want to create a simple composable that is going to host other things. So let's create here another composable. Let's call this hourly. And here we can get the info item. Basically here we can just call hourly dot info item. Okay, so you can see here this data is actually arranged in a column format. So we can easily just create here a column. Let's create a column and we want to customize it a little bit. For this case, let's give it a modifier first. And we can give it a padding of 8 dp. The next case, we want to arrange everything horizontally. So we can call here alignment, center horizontally, and also the vertical alignment arrangement. So we can call here arrangement.center, and everything is perfectly aligned. So the first case, we want to display the text that is going to show up actually the data about the temperature. So for this case, we can just and here we can just pass in our degree text. Okay, so we can change the style. Okay, the next case, we can easily just copy this and paste it below here. Okay, so before everything here, I want to create an icon, and here we can just pass in here the painter resource, and let's call the info item. Okay, so we're going to pass in here the icon, and this is just the icon which you are seeing here. And basically here we can just pass in null for content description. Lastly, here we have our text. So instead just of displaying this, we want to display our time. And here we can just remove this. Okay, so for this case, we can just call here hourly weather info item. And here we can just pass in the info item. And everything is looking perfectly. Okay, so we can just come below here, and you can see we have here our current weather, and inside here we can show our hourly weather item, and we can just call it .hourly. And also we can pass in here the modifier. Let's pass in here modifier. And this one we want to align it to the bottom, so we can just call here alignment.bottom center. Okay, so now we have completed two things here. So we have here our current weather, and also we have here our hourly weather data. So we want to display the sunrise and the UV index. And basically this one we can easily just do it below here. Okay, so this one is going to be inside our daily info. So for this case, we can use our home state .weather, and sorry, here we have to use our daily weather info. And this can be nullable. Also, we can use a let scope function to scope the nullability. Okay, so you can see here we have two items, and I want to use a row in order to structure everything. So for this case, let's create a row here, and we can customize it here. Let's pass in first the modifier, and we can fill the max width. And let's give it a padding of 16 dp. Okay, and another case here we can give it, so here we want to give this padding of top, overall padding. Okay, and here we can give it the arrangement, and we want to use arrangement.space between so that they can space each other. Okay, so I'm going to create here two separate composables to host this. So we have the sunrise and the UV index. Okay, so let's go below here. Let's create a new composable. Let's call this sunset weather item. Okay, so here we're going to use this daily weather info. And as you can see here, we're using a card. So we can create here a card. Okay, so I want to give this a padding horizontally of 8 dp. Okay, so I want to surround everything inside the column so that I can control it more. So for this case, I can pass in here in the first case the modifier. And I want to give it the padding of 16 dp. And I want to align everything center. So we can call here alignment.center horizontally, and vertically we want to use arrangement center. Okay, now let's create here the first text. So this one is going to be sunrise. And here let's use headline small. Now here we can use our weather information for the sunrise. So let's use here weather info. Sunrise. And here instead of headline, let's use our display medium. Lastly, let's duplicate this. So here first this is going to be sunset. We can write it here. Then we can display our time. So for this case, we can call our weather info sunset. So we have here our sunrise item. Now let's create this UV index. And also here we can just duplicate it. So let's just press Ctrl D by highlighting all of them and duplicate this sunset here. And instead, let's light here UV index. Now here we can change UV index. Okay, so here we can use status. Now weather info. Then basically we can use our weather status dot information here to get that particular status of this particular weather info. So we have here two items, so we can just go back. Okay, now let's create here a sunset weather item, and we can just use this it. And also we can pass in the UV index and pass it. Okay, so because here we inside our box, we aligned everything to the center. So this one we don't want to provide any type of alignment. It will be aligned to the center. So this one is going to be the top, this one bottom, then everything else is going to be to the center. Okay, so everything here is completed and we want to test run our application. So for this case, we can just go to our main activity. Okay, so basically here, let's delete these because we no longer need them. Okay, so another case here, I want to create another composable. So let's press Ctrl Alt M in order to extract this outside of the function. And this one I'm going to call it Jet Weather App. And here let's call our home screen, pass a modifier, and we can give it padding and use the inner padding from the scaffold. So let's put here our inner padding. And now everything is looking perfectly. So let's try to test run our application and see the output. Okay, so here we are getting an error whenever we try to run our application. You can see the given component holder does not implement interface Dagger Hilt. And basically we forgot to do one thing here. So inside our main activity, we are supposed to tell, hey, this one is going to be, this one is at 100 entry point. And basically we Dagger Hilt, hey, basically in this component here, we're going to use Jetpack Compose so you can create these Dagger Hilt containers for our dependencies. And also we should not forget another thing here is we have to create. So let's create here a Jet Weather application. So basically here we have to inherit from the application class. And here we have to tell, hey, this is Hilt Android app. And basically we tell, hey, this one is going to be our whole application. So you can create the containers for the dependencies for our application. And after that, we have to register this new class inside here, our Android manifest. So here we have to add the name, Jetweather application. And also we should use the permissions, because here we're going to use internet permissions. Otherwise we are going to get errors. So we can call here uses permission. And here we have to call the internet. Now let's try to rerun again and see. Okay, so here is our output, and you can see here we have a small problem, and this sunrise here is going to overlay the current data. And basically here we have the sunset bigger, and also the UV index is not going to be displayed. So for this case, we can just go to our home screen. So let's go directly here inside our sunset. And this one is supposed to be, so here we have to make this body medium, not the biggest one. Similarly here, let's make this body medium. Okay, now let's try to rerun again and see the changes we have made. Okay, so now everything is aligned perfectly. So you can see here we have our sunrise and the UV index and also the current, and everything is looking perfectly here. So you can see also this one is going to be scrollable. And now everything is looking perfectly. And one thing which I'm noticing here is we are passing the wind speed twice. So here we are supposed to pass in the wind direction and not wind speed again. So let's just go to our current weather. Okay, so here instead of wind speed, we have to pass wind direction. So we have our wind speed and wind direction. Let's relearn this. Okay, so here we have our wind speed, that is 7.7, and it's going 1000. And I think also this kilometer per hour will come before this. And actually we have the wind speed with the unit. Then we have here the wind direction directly. So we can just relearn again. Okay, so here it's perfectly 7.7 kilometer per hour heading 1000. So now everything is set up for our home screen. So I want to recreate this 7-day forecast here. So let's do this next. Okay, so for this case, let's go inside here our UI, and we can create here a new package. Let's call this daily. And inside here, let's create a daily home screen, a daily view model, sorry. Okay, so this one is going to inherit from the view model. And here we can pass in our weather repository. Okay, and here let's just call this Hilt view model. And similarly here we can create our data class to hold the state. So the first case, we have our daily item. And by default, this is going to be nullable. And if we have any error, this is just going to be of type a string. And by default, this is nullable and is loading. Okay, so here we can generate our state. And inside here, let's initialize. And inside our init block, we can make our request. So let's use our view model scope and launch, because we're using here a suspend function. So we can call here repository, and we can fetch again our weather data, and we want to collect. And here we receive a response. Okay, so here we can use a when statement again. So let's just pass in here the response. Now we can check is loading. Here we can just call our daily state. Let's copy our daily state and check if is loading. And here we can set this to be true. And here when we are a success, and here whenever we have an error. So the first case here, we are loading, we can make this to be false because we have successfully fetched the data. And here we can pass in the daily data. So we can just call here a response. And let's call here our daily. The next case is the error. If we have it, we can just pass in here to be null. And whenever we have an error here, we can set the loading back to false. And we can pass the error message by using the response.errorMessage. Okay, now everything is looking perfectly. Okay, now we want to create our screen here. So let's do this. So inside here, our daily package, we can create a new coding class or file. And let's call this daily screen. Okay, so here we can create our composable and call this daily screen. And here we can pass in our daily view model, and we can use our Hilt view model. Okay, and here we can fetch our state. So we can just call here our daily state. We can use our daily view model and get our daily state. Okay, so for our daily item here, you can see we are going to be displaying here these information which are coming from this. So whenever a user selects here, for example, it select this one, then also this one is going to change as the user has selected a different day. So we can just change also the information about it here. So for that case, I want to create a state that can keep track of this. So let's create here a state and call this selected weather index. And here we want to use the mutable int state of, and basically by default we're going to start at 0. This one is supposed to be a val. Okay, now we have to get also that selected item by default, so we can just call this and we have to pass in here the key. So we can use the selected weather index, that to be our key. And also whenever the daily state is going to change, so we can call here E2. Let's add another key. And here we can use our daily state. So this, remember, is going to keep track of these two states. Whenever they change, then they can also change. So for this case, we can call here our daily state. And here we can get now our selected index, weather index here. Okay, so I'm keeping here two keys. So the first time this is the selected weather index, and this one is going to change whenever a user is going to click, and it's going to reflect this. And this one is the daily state. So for example, initially whenever we open up our daily screen, then we don't have any data. So whenever we fetch the data, then the state is going to change. So we want this also to reflect the changes. So for this case, we can fetch and get that actual item. Or otherwise, sometimes the first time we cannot see any type of data displayed there. So for that case, to avoid this, we have to pass in these two keys to reflect the changes. Okay, so for that case, we can arrange everything inside a column. So let's create here a column. Let's pass in here a modifier. And we can use that modifier supplied. And we can fill the max size. Let's give it a padding of 16 dp. Now let's pass in here the horizontal alignment. So we want to center it horizontally, and vertical arrangement, and here we want to call arrangement.s evenly. Okay, so the first item which we want to show here is these two text here. Let's call here our current weather item. So this one can be nullable, so we don't want to have any errors, so we can just call here let to scope this. So for that case, we can create our text, and here we can pass in marks, for example. Okay, so we can change here also the style. So we want to use body medium, so we can just call here body medium. And now everything is looking perfectly. Okay, so inside here, I want to create spacer. And this is just the text which we are seeing here, that is 7-day forecast. So for that case, let's just write here 7 days. And let's use headline small. Copy this. And here we can just pass in 8. Okay, so after that, we want to display this. So you can see this is a scrollable, so we can use here lazy row to display the items. So let's create here lazy row. Now we can use here our daily state, and we want to get our daily item, and this can be nullable. So we can use here a let scope function. Now let's call here our daily. And now here we can use items indexed and pass in here the item. So let's pass in here our daily. Okay, so this one is not actually a list, so we have to pass in here the weather info. That is particularly a list. Here basically we are going to have the index and also the weather info. Okay, also whenever we select a particular item, you can see we are changing the color. So for this case, we can create a state that we can keep track of. So let's create here a variable and call this selected color. And this one is going to check between an if statement. So we can check here if the selected index is going to be equal to the index for the current item. So if this is going to be true, then we can use the material theme. And we use the inverse surface. And else, if this is not the case, then we can use the card's default. So let's call here our card default. And we can get the container color. Okay, so let's create a separate composable to hold this item here. So let's just go below here. Okay, so here we have our daily weather info. So also we want to get here our weather info item. Also here we want to get the background color. And the next case is the on click. Okay, so let's keep this outside here. Let's press Ctrl X. Okay, so for this case, we can create here our card. And for the on click here, we can just pass in here the on click listener. Let's use the modifier. Let's give it a padding of 8 dp. And here we can change the colors. And let's use the card's default and change the colors. And here inside, we want to change the container color now. And we can call here our background color and leave everything as they are. Okay, so inside here, we can create a column. that is going to hoist our data. And here we can pass in the modifier now. Let's give it a 16 dp padding. And we can keep everything centered. Okay, so here we can create our text. Okay, so one thing, let's just go here to our home screen. And for this case, we can just copy this. Let's press Ctrl C because this one is going to be similar to what we are seeing here. So let's just paste it here. And instead of using the info item, here we can just use the weather info. And we can use this temperature. And similarly here, we can use the weather info and get the weather status. And similarly here, let's use just the weather info and time. And now everything is looking perfectly. Okay, so here let's use our daily weather info item. And here we can pass in our weather info. And pass in here the background color. And here we have the on click. Let's just keep it inside here for readability purposes. So let's just call this on click. And basically whenever we click here, we can change the selected index. Okay, so our lazy draw here is completed. Let's copy this and paste it here. So the next item here which we want to show is this card here. So we can easily do it below here. Now let's access the current weather, current daily weather item. Let's use here a let scope function. And we can create a card. And here we can fill the max width. And give it a padding of 16 dp. And also let's pass in here the horizontal alignment. And we want to align it center horizontally. Okay, so the first item here, you can see we have these two icons. So we are going to have the icon and the text here. So for this case, we can use a row. Here we want to keep everything centered. So let's pass in here the horizontal arrangement and keep it center, and vertical alignment. Also, we can keep center vertically. Now let's display our icon. And here we can use our wind icon, and here we can just keep null. Okay, let's add here a spacer. So here we are going to give a width of 80 dp. And let's create here a text, and this one is just going to be wind. Let's change the style and use body media. So the first part is completed. So here we can just create another spacer. Let's just copy this. And instead of 8 dp, let's give it 4 dp. Let's create here our text. So we can just access the weather info item here. We can use it. And also we can pass in here the weather direction. So let's call here its wind direction. Okay, let's change the style also. So we want to make this headline medium. So we can just use headline medium. Let's give it a max lines of 1. And if we have any overflows, then we want to show ellipses. So if the text is going to be bigger. So we have completed here one of our items also. Okay, so we have completed to create this. Now we can show here the sunrise and the UV index. And if you remember, we have already created these two items from our previous screen. So we can just reuse that. So below this, let's add here a spacer. We can just copy this and add it below here. Let's pass in here modifier, and we can fill the max width. And we want to pass in here space between. Okay, so we can call here a sunset weather item, and here we have to pass in the weather info. So basically we can just call here it, and also the UV index. So we can call here UV index weather item. Okay, so our home screen here is actually complete. So one thing which I want also here to incorporate is whenever we are loading. So let's just copy this data, everything from here. So let's just press Ctrl X and use here a when statement. Now we can use here our daily state and check is loading. So if we are actually loading here, so we can make if this is true, then we can show a circular progress indicator. So we don't want to pass any progress. And else, if this is not the case, then we can actually display everything. And if you want to check if there is any error, basically you can just create here inside a statement that is going to check up for error storages. So our daily screen is also complete. So we can just go inside our main activity. So let's press Ctrl E and call this main activity. So here we called our home screen. So let's call here our daily screen and test the daily screen. Let's try to rerun. Okay, so our data is displayed here, but I'm seeing here we have this is taking up the whole height. So I think we call the fill max height. So we can easily fix this. So let's just directly go here. Okay, so instead of fill max size here, we are supposed to call fill max width. Okay, let's just call this and rerun it again. Okay, so the changes have been applied and you can see everything is looking perfectly here. So let's try to change here. You can see our data is actually changing here also. So another case here, we don't have a space. So you can see everything is interconnected. So here basically we can just add a little spacer and let's try to apply the changes. Okay, so now we have neatly organized here, and also below here I think it's going to be perfectly. So if we add a space before and a space after, then I think it's going to be perfectly fine. Okay, so you can see here everything is neatly organized. And here we have our first item, and whenever we change here, you can see also the other items here are changing because they are depending from that daily weather item. And you can see here our UV index and other things are changing also. So I think our daily weather item is actually completed. So the next case is to create that tab navigation, and we can easily do this next. Okay, so we have completed to create our home screen and also our daily screen. So the next case is to create this bottom navigation here, which is really easy. So for this case, we're just going to navigate directly here to our main activity and start to build this. And when you go to our utils package, you can see that we have this tabs class that is just an enum class. So this one has a home and it contains a title and icon, and also we have the daily that has a title and also an icon. Okay, so for this case, let's just go back to our main activity and build here a bottom navigation bar. Okay, so inside here, let's create a new composable. So we can call this jet weather bottom navigation bar. Okay, so inside here, we can use a navigation bar. And let's give it this default modifier here. Okay, so for a case, we are going to pass in here several parameters. Okay, the first parameter, we want to get a list of tabs. And also the selected index is an integer, and the unselected change is going to be of type int, and this one returns a unit. Okay, so inside here, we're going to use the tabs. And for each indexed, now we can create navigation bar items. So for selected here, we can just compare the index with the selected index if this is going to be similar. Then here for the on click, so we can invoke here the selected index change and basically pass in the index. And here we can pass in the icon. So let's create here a new icon. And for content description, we can use tab.title. Okay, so another case, I want to add the label text. So here we can just call the label. And here we can pass in a normal text. And for this, we can use tabs with title. Okay, so our bottom navigation bar here is completed. Okay, so inside here, our jet weather app, we're going to create a state that is going to keep track of the selected tab index. So here selected, let's just make this tab index. So here we can use remember savable, and we can use a mutable state int of, and by default, we're just going to start with 1 or with 0. Okay, so here we have to pass in the bottom bar. Now we can call here our jet weather bottom bar navigation. And here for tabs, we can use our tabs which we have created and call entries. Now the selected tab index, we can just use the selected tab index. And here we have the on click. Whenever we click this, so we can just call here our selected tab index and change it. Okay, so instead here of using directly the daily screen, so we can just press Ctrl X and use a when statement. So we are not going to use Jetpack navigation because it's just 2 screens. So for this case, we can call here our selected tab index. So when the selected tab index is going to be equal to 0, then we're going to return here a home screen. Let's give it a modifier. And here we can pass in a padding. And when the index is going to be equal to 1, then we can just pass in here our daily screen. Okay, so our navigation here is completed. So for this case, we are going to use the state here to detect which screen we are going to show at the moment. So for this case, let's try to run our application and see the changes we have made. Okay, so our application is launched successfully. And here you can see we have the bottom bar navigation and everything is looking perfectly. So now you can try to click here. You can see it's loading and basically we're displaying the data. So everything is working perfectly. So we can easily shift here. And our bottom bar navigation is working perfect. So guys, let's leave it here for this video. If you find this video helpful, please don't forget to provide a like, subscribe, and share. And if you want to learn more about Jetpack Compose, Clean Architecture, and Android in general, I have compiled a course in Udemy, so you can find the link in the description box below here. So see you there. Bye bye for now. Thank you.